3. Apophis Asteroid Apocalypse Episodes 19, 20, and 21, by J. M. Conradi. This is a work of fiction, and any resemblance to real people and events is purely coincidental. It takes place in the future, therefore past events and historic or current persons are not depicted. This Christmas release is less than an hour long, because of a lack of resources. The story is written, but I lack funding and support this year to record a full hour of it. Please consider sharing this with friends and fellow apocalyptic audiobook fans so that we can achieve our target of 1,000 subscribers. Due to the risk of this story partially becoming true in 2029, it is important. Except of course if government and media always tell the truth and there is nothing to worry about. Introduction. Please do not miss out on the preceding 18 episodes. They are available as single videos, or on YouTube for free, as hour-long omnibus compilations. Here we go. And a great star fell from the sky, burning, like a torch, Revelations 8 verse 10. This is a difficult story to tell, and probably beyond my capability. But I am writing this journal anyway to whomever it may concern. In fiction, like computer games, the awful deaths of millions or even billions of strangers are mentioned dismissively, as long as the protagonist's circle doesn't die too much and make the main character appear ineffective. Heaven and earth could be moved to save the selected ones whose names we know. Well, if only mankind worked on moving heaven and earth to avoid the tragedy of 2029, having had centuries of warnings to heed. But it wasn't a popular cause. All our charity and all our profit would come to naught if Apophis landed. Yet we dismissed it all too easily given its erratic path, its chaotic nature, its variables. Was it not abnormal enough to warrant more attention? This was no ordinary asteroid. It is different from fiction, to have to relate such tragedy in a journal of what I witnessed that awful year and afterwards. I hope it may perhaps be worth my tears, if a future civilization reads it and takes warnings more seriously than propaganda. Or, if a time traveler takes it back to the right time and place to change mankind's focus or path, a path of transparency and less centralized power, so that priorities could change for real dangers, instead of secret agendas. Maybe you, dear reader, are the one to warn that mankind is focusing on the wrong priorities and causes. Because it was hard, but not completely impossible, to stop Apophis or reduce the harm. If only we had focused on it in time, instead of humoring lucrative social fantasies, as if mankind is the determining factor in the cosmos. Human nature cannot be changed by adding some flowery words. Nonetheless, wordmongers and the means to broadcast them, ruled. Meantime the apocalypse had been bearing down on us for millions of years, and we had been warned for thousands of years. Remember the Wormwood prophecy? It was almost as if the physical cosmic truth was obscured by a veil, and only the most spiritually connected could see partial ghostly glimpses of what was coming. This, despite the mathematical fact that Apophis would, eventually, strike Earth. But media owners set modern man's priorities. They determined which partial glimpses were conspiracy theories, and which partial glimpses were science, based on where those bosses could gain power. And we obeyed media, the false prophet, like sheep, until it was too late. Episode 19, Armageddon. Military might did not end the potential world war festering at Megiddo Mountain. The millions of angry attackers flocking to camps just north of that mountain lacked electricity, clean water, sanitation, and health care. The Magi did a great job trying to feed them, but that was becoming impossible. Cholera appeared, and then spread like wildfire among that great host who wanted to end Israel forever. Without fuel, the Israeli Defense Force was struggling to hold back the attackers. Even their technological edge was neutralized by interference from unmarked planes, missiles, and industrial sabotage from somewhere else. They were slowly withdrawing before the sheer numbers of zealous attackers. But then the assault began to wane. Soldiers were simply too sick to care. Without proper health care, ailments accumulated that would never be properly diagnosed, sores that could have been syphilis or a kind of plague, a medieval red flux, and other horrors spread among the multitude of attackers. That being the ones who were not yet down with cholera. A few managed to flee death, but soon a mountain of millions of infected corpses grew just north of Mount Megiddo, threatening the survival of the whole Middle East. Then Israel, the only orderly large government still at work in the area, took a logical decision that would anew make them the center of hate and anger, for as long as humans exist. A mountain of flame descended on the festering mess of flies and rot north of Megiddo, in the form of a small tactical nuke. The whole area was obliterated in an inferno, and the war was over. What the outfall exactly did, was unclear, given the unverified state of several alleged nuclear blasts in the world, since Good Friday 13th of April 2029. Aware of the historicity of the moment, Israel tried to be transparent. The war room debate, the vote in parliament, and the whole recording of the act of delivering a small nuclear bomb, was after a 3-hour delay, broadcast on the only global mass media available, shortwave radio. In one faraway mountain community, even Marnus heard short bits of it, and informed Charlie and his dad, but they were mostly in the dark. Europe complained, Russia complained, China complained, but nobody was really in a position to do much, except end the world, which they were not in the mood for. From the USA an eerie silence continued. The underground bunker complex, which effectively was the federal government, was split in two by huge blast-resistant doors, and so were the two factions of government, locked in their stalemate, the president, and his opponents who had instituted the 25th Amendment. Negotiations had begun, and the only mutually acceptable resolution was a national election in November 2029. Despite having been elected by mail votes herself, the president insisted on a hand-counted election in person with voter ID. There was no way any electronic system would be accepted, all existing election laws would be suspended for this, and replaced by that centuries-old process. The Republican speaker demurred that how was she able to trust systems before, but not now that ethanol-powered generators ran their electronics? But there was no way out. She would veto any other early election bill. Time was running out for these federal elites, because several warlord generals were becoming too powerful outside that bunker. A unified return to order was overdue. And so, the lawyers began the slow process of drawing up detailed agreement documents, in a new world where agreement documents really meant nothing. They were not part of the reality of an apocalypse raging outside their bunker. They worked on the assumption that normality would resume, and concepts like millions of crazed cannibals were far removed. Their bunker was provisioned to hold out in relative luxury, for a very long time, and Washington, D.C. ambled on, below ground. Meanwhile, for ordinary folks, the world was burning. Episode 20, Ignorance may be bliss, but could be deadly. Unaware of world events at the time, except for small snippets of news, caught by Marnus on their solar-powered shortwave radio and communication setup, the people of the mountain community went about their daily survival routine. The younger men were practicing, for the war that would inevitably come. The community was preparing for a long, harsh winter. Unlike the ignorant but profitable sensationalism about climate change before April 13, 2029, which ignored billions of years of unknown data that made it ridiculous, the climate and weather were really upended by the apocalypse. Sunlight was reduced by a third due to smoke and dust in the atmosphere, and many water sources were contaminated. Airflow patterns and waterflow patterns were disrupted. What little was left of the world economy, further being destroyed by war, was insufficient to sustain the remaining world population, in these harsh conditions. The year after Apophis struck, was 1,000 times more tragic than the actual impact. Knowing all this due to Ian's comprehensive research about the potential results of April 13, 2029, they were looking into mushroom farming, inside the bunker room of the water reservoirs, where they could also provide some solar-powered heat. There were also natural crevasses in the mountainous rocks, and bits of deep forest, where mushrooms had naturally sprung forth, which they were looking at. In preparation for winter, which could be deadly in the aftermath of Apophis, with sunlight being reduced by about a third on average, their raiding parties had gathered tons of blankets. It was relatively easy, because what other gangs there were still active raiding the nearby cities, blankets were the last thing they were thinking about. However, gathering a mountain of blankets for a campsite of hundreds of tents was one thing, but cleaning them and keeping them clean in a campsite of hundreds of tents was a lot more difficult. The laundry team and the shifts of the helpers they need had to be boosted significantly to prepare and sustain the blankets. What little solar power batteries they could take from other processes, and use them for heaters, would have to be concentrated in the mess tent. Keeping it all invisible from the valleys below was a challenge. All of the sick, the elderly, and the babies would have to be brought together, to sleep in that tent, if the predicted temperature drops of winter panned out. The rest of the community would have to rely on blankets, without any fires at night, and of course many complained about this. As usual, the northern part of the mountain reserve housed most of the complainants. Keeping the peace was an issue for Charlie, despite this being just a few months into the apocalypse, and survival being the top priority. The growing threat of cannibal hordes roaming the valleys below often saved their community from strife, and a calamitous splitting up of their group. Sheila was a great aid in this process, having made friends with women from the northern community. Ian, on the other hand, was still a divisive figure because of the murder of the old man at the nursery, his talk of war, and even practicing shield wall battles with medieval weapons. Authors note, what was Biff doing at this time? You will have to hang on for another 2 episodes to find out, because he was off on a tangent of his own. When war inevitably came to their little corner of a famished post-apocalyptic world, unity and numbers would be almost as important as their preparation, their vigilance, and their continued work to strengthen the perimeter fence that kept the world out. But what was happening elsewhere? In the USA, DC types went their merry way in the underground bunker stalemate while, outside, the real world was changing fast. The lack of overpowering technology allowed power vacuums, quickly filled by survival opportunists. Though few would know it at the time, the future of England was decided at a surprisingly small battle that echoed back to a forgotten history. 2 generals battled it out for consolidated power on a hill at a place called Woden's Field north of Birmingham, on August 5, 2029. The few machine guns and their limited ammunition quickly obliterated each other, so the rest of the battle played out with farm implements, axes and a surprising number of collectors' swords in the hands of desperate, hungry soldiers. Primitive drugs and, for officers only, beer, fueled a barbaric level of battle rage, where the ultimate power was grabbed by the strongest hand, a Scotsman who framed himself as a Jacobite. One could for a moment imagine time traveling, and maybe that was the answer, to travel back in time to shake up the world. Shake it up completely, in the hope of creating a timeline where humankind would prepare itself for realities like Apophis, instead of mirages of issues, manufactured to benefit a select few dishonestly through that barbaric power game of the modern era, politics. But that, the possibility of time travel, is a story for a completely separate book. Episode 21, Preparing for Being Dependent on Mushrooms, You Might Need This One Day. It was a desperately cold July of 2029. The mountain reserve community resisted the risk of wood fires at night because that could be visible from afar in those dark post-apocalyptic nights. Their raiding parties were hard-pressed to find ever-dwindling stores of non-perishable food and blankets for everyone. By the end July the quality of sunlight receded even further. Unbeknown to them at the time, the burning war in the Middle East, including the 2 failed nuclear missiles, and reinvigorated volcanoes of the Ring of Fire, were increasing the global levels of poison and ash in the atmosphere. In addition, with little organized firefighting, Forest fires were still smoldering after the out-of-control fires caused by fiery ejecta on 13 and April 14. The fact remained that trees and crops were not growing, their first barley harvest was going to be meager, their new fruit trees months away from bearing even tiny fruits, and the gardens or shops within easy reach were mostly stripped bare. The concept of mushroom farming was becoming essential. Ian had bought trays of spores early in April and now discussed ways to improve on their feeble results to date. It was decided to change to the bucket method, given that there were many buckets available. You may grow mushrooms in a variety of containers, from bags to logs, but buckets are often one of the simplest and most useful methods of growing. Growing mushrooms in buckets mean you don't need any expensive or specialist equipment, and you can create a great number of mushrooms with little work. It's a great approach for beginners to start growing mushrooms because it doesn't require any special abilities or prior knowledge. Small-scale mushroom production and urban mushroom gardening are ideal for growing mushrooms in buckets. Whatever space you have, in a spare room, cupboard, or basement, you don't need much to create an effective mushroom production system. Growing mushrooms in buckets, like every other form of mushroom cultivation, has advantages and disadvantages. Advantages: buckets are easy to come by. The buckets can be reused, reducing the amount of plastic waste produced, as opposed to growing mushrooms in bags. Buckets are self-supporting and do not require additional support like larger grow bags. Buckets can be stacked, allowing you to maximize your storage capacity. Disadvantages: washing buckets before reuse is time-consuming, making them unsuitable for large-scale commercial production. When full of the substrate, large buckets may be difficult to handle. Contamination danger is higher. Depending on the species of mushrooms and whether you plan to grow them indoors or outdoors, the ideal substrate to utilize for growing mushrooms may vary. Coffee grounds, wood chips, straw, sugar cane bagasse, cocoa coir, and vermiculite, as well as sawdust, hardwood pellets, manure, logs, and cardboard, are all popular mushroom growing substrates. Growing mushrooms from coffee grounds is an easy to work with and low-tech mushroom substrate choice. Coffee grounds do not require pasteurization or sterilization as long as they are put to use quickly and handled with proper hygiene and care. In buckets, you can cultivate a variety of side-fruiting mushroom types. Lion's mane and oyster mushrooms are examples of wild mushrooms that grow on trees and would sprout sideways. Oyster mushrooms are the greatest choice for bucket growing. They grow quickly, are less sensitive to environmental factors than many other mushrooms, and may be grown on a variety of substrates. Bucket culture is ideal for side-fruiting oyster mushroom species such as white, pink, blue, or yellow oyster mushrooms. Below we walk you through the process of growing oyster mushrooms in a bucket with these step-by-step instructions. For our example, we'll be using straw substrate and oyster mushroom spawn. Step 1. Preparing your equipment. Before you begin to grow your mushrooms in buckets, you will need a 20-liter, 5-gallon, plastic bucket. You have the option of purchasing a new bucket, which is easily accessible and inexpensive, or reuse an existing bucket. Consider any chemicals that may have been in the bucket before. If you're utilizing a second-hand bucket, these may infect your mushrooms. If you're unsure, it's better to start with a fresh, clean bucket. Mushroom spawn, i.e. oyster mushroom grain spawn. To produce oyster mushrooms in a 20-liter bucket, use spawn at a rate of 5 to 10 per center. This means every 20 liters, 5 gallons, bucket will require 1 to 2.3 kg of grain spawn. A 10 per center spawn rate will quickly occupy the bucket, increasing your odds. However, you can get away with using less and still be successful. Mushroom substrate mix, i.e. straw or wood chips. We recommend a straw substrate for your first foray into growing mushrooms in buckets. This is because the particle size of shredded/chopped straw allows for optimum air exchange. If you can't find chopped straw, you can buy a bale of straw and cut it into short pieces no longer than 5 centimeters. You'll need enough chopped straw to completely fill your bucket. Electric drill and 12 mm drill bit. This will be used to make holes in your bucket. Microporous tape. Micropore tape is an adhesive paper tape that is breathable. It's sold at pharmacies alongside bandages and dressings. During incubation, cover the holes in the bucket with microporous tape to keep moisture in whilst still allowing air exchange. Pasteurization container. A container to hold your water. This container should be large enough to hold the amount of pasteurized substrate you intend to use. Step 2. Preparing the bucket. After you've gathered all of your materials, it's time to get your bucket ready. Drilling the holes. To begin, drill holes all the way around the outside of your bucket. The holes in the bucket's side serve as both ventilation and fruiting holes. The mycelium produces carbon dioxide during colonization. The bucket's holes allow fresh air to circulate and regulate carbon dioxide levels. There are no hard and fast rules here, however. We recommend drilling holes that are 10 to 15 millimeters in diameter and spaced 10 to 15 centimeters apart. You can also drill a few small holes in the bucket's bottom to drain any surplus water. Remove any jagged portions with a knife once you've completed drilling the holes. Then, using warm soapy water, thoroughly clean your bucket and lid. Sterilizing the bucket. Before you use your bucket, you need to sterilize it to ensure no bacteria will infect your fresh mushroom spawn. You can sterilize your bucket in a few ways. Isopropyl alcohol. This should be used to clean your bucket as well as all of your materials and equipment. It's critical to sanitize everything throughout this process to avoid the spread of unwanted bacteria. Heat sterilization. You can also use boiling water to sterilize your bucket. This is an easy and inexpensive way to clean your bucket, Simply fill it with boiling water and wait for it to cool. Step 3. Pasteurizing the substrate mix. Pasteurization is used to make your substrate fairly contaminate-free in order to offer your oyster mushroom culture a head start. You can pasteurize your straw in 2 ways. Hot water pasteurization. This process entails immersing your substrate in a large pot of boiling water for 1 hour at 60 to 80 degrees Celsius. Before you add your mushroom spawn, ensure that the heat pasteurized substrate has been cooled for at least 8 hours. Cold water lime pasteurization. Cold water lime pasteurization uses lime to raise the pH of the water, effectively destroying pollutants. It involves soaking your substrate in a bath of lime-treated cold water for 24 hours. It's less energy-intensive than other popular pasteurization methods. For this process you will need hydrated lime, water, straw, a netted bag, bucket or container, gloves, mask, pH levels testing materials, disinfectant spray or isopropyl alcohol. Below we outline the process to pasteurize using hydrated lime. Fill your netted bag halfway with chopped or shredded straw. To make room for the substrate, fill your container with water to around 60% of its capacity. When you submerge the substrate in the water, if it's too full, it'll overflow. Wearing gloves to protect your hands and a mask to avoid inhaling fumes, apply hydrated lime to the water at a rate of 0.2% lime to water content. For every liter of water, 2 grams of hydrated lime is used. Stir well after sprinkling the lime into the water. Take a sample of water and test the pH after the lime has dissolved. A pH level of 11 to 13 is ideal. You can now immerse your straw bag in the lime bath. Because the bag of straw will float, you'll need to weigh it down with a heavy object to keep it totally covered. Allow the straw to pasteurize and hydrate in the lime bath for 16 to 20 hours. Using your disinfectant spray or isopropyl alcohol, wipe any surfaces you intend to use. Remove the bag from the water and hang it on a rail or place it on a sterilized surface. Allow it to drain for at least an hour. Before using the straw, it must have reached field capacity, which normally takes about an hour. If you're in a rush, take the straw out of the bag and place it on a clean, sterilized surface to expedite the process. The squeeze test is the simplest way to check if the straw is ready. Squeeze it in your hand and if it only releases a few drops of water, it is ready. If too much water leaks out, it needs to drain for a little longer. Step 4. Add mushroom spawn into the substrate mix. Once it's properly drained, it's time to inoculate your pasteurized straw. To avoid contamination, you should complete this procedure as soon as possible after pasteurization. First, use the alcohol spray to clean the interior of your bucket. Then use a small square of micropore tape to plug the holes on the bucket's sides. Assemble something similar to a lasagna or layer cake in the bucket by layering straw and grain spawn. Begin with a layer of the substrate at the bottom of the bucket, followed by a layer of spawn, and then more substrate. Stack the straw and spawn in the bucket until it's completely full. Make sure your last layer is a layer of straw when you get to the top of the bucket. Fill the bucket to the brim and pack it firmly, but not so tightly that it escapes through the holes. Place the bucket's lid on top and label it. To keep track, it's a good idea to jot down the date, mushroom species, and substrate you used. Place micropore tape over the holes once you have filled your bucket. You do this to maintain moisture within your substrate whilst allowing for optimal air exchange and circulation. Step 5. Allow mycelium to colonize, the incubation period. Before you can get a crop of mushrooms, the mycelium must thoroughly colonize the substrate. Place your bucket in a warm, dark location that is warm at all times of the day and night. The optimal temperature for incubation is between 18 and 24 degrees Celsius. This is the average room temperature in various places. How long does it take to colonize? The rate of colonization is affected by temperature, the amount of spawn utilized, and the type of mushroom cultivated. Complete colonization should take 10 to 14 days at room temperature. After 5 days, open the lid and inspect the straw for any spots of white, cottony growth. The patches will connect up over time, anywhere from 10 to 21 days, and the substrate will turn totally white with mycelium. It's possible that the mycelium will push through the tape and begin to fruit. Step 6. Fruiting. When the mycelium runs out of food, substrate, at the end of colonization, it will be eager to produce mushrooms in order to survive. Mushrooms in the wild grow in reaction to stress, such as a lack of food or changes in their habitat. All you have to do to recreate this is provide the correct circumstances for mushroom growth. Below we outline a few things you need to consider. Temperature. The optimal temperature for fruiting varies by mushroom strain and is unique to each. However, the majority of oyster mushroom strains aren't too picky. They should fruit as long as the temperature is between 10 and 30 degrees Celsius. Humidity. It's important to keep humidity levels consistent when mushrooms are developing. Because the mushrooms will develop from the holes in the bucket, misting the holes many times a day will keep the mycelium from drying out. Baby mushrooms thrive in humid environments, and if the mushrooms become too dry, they will stop growing. So, mist as often as you can, or cover the bucket with a bag to keep the humidity up. Humidity levels are less important once you've passed the first growth stage. However, you should keep spraying the mushrooms twice a day to promote growth and prevent them from drying up. Airflow. When exposed to fresh air, the mycelium is stimulated and will start to produce mushrooms. In the wild, oyster mushrooms will grow from stumps or logs in fresh, oxygen-rich air. To make sure your mushrooms get adequate airflow, you can remove the tape from the holes once you see small pinheads start to grow. Though if you're growing your mushrooms outside, you'll want to keep them out of the wind so they don't dry out while growing. Light. For oyster mushrooms to grow, they require some light, but not too much. A shady location with indirect lighting will work best. Make sure the bucket isn't in direct sunlight or too close to a light or another source of heat, such as a hot lamp. Step 7. Harvesting your mushrooms. When the caps of your oyster mushrooms start to flatten out and curl upwards, it's the perfect time to harvest them. It signifies they're on the verge of releasing their spores. It's better to harvest them before they lose all of their spores and begin to degrade. Beginners may find it difficult to determine when this is the case. It's time to harvest your oyster mushrooms if they stop growing, start drying out, or start dropping a lot of spores, white dust. Cutting the whole cluster off at the back against the hole in the bucket with a sharp knife is the easiest technique to harvest a bucket of mushrooms. Your colonized substrate can produce a second and even a smaller third crop of mushrooms. To aid this, use a pointed knife to remove any remaining stem fragments, leaving only the substrate visible in the hole. Continue to spray water into the holes twice a day. The mycelium will recolonize the holes in a few days, and more mushrooms will emerge in 1 to 2 weeks, giving you another flush. Keep in mind though, that the more successful your farming is, the more ready you should be to defend yourself against famished hordes, in a post-apocalyptic world. And that, in a nutshell, is how to prepare being dependent on mushrooms, in a low sunlight post-apocalypse world. I hope you will never have to use this knowledge.
Asteroid Apophis.
Revelation 8, verse 10. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch.
Apophis, Asteroid Apophis. Asteroid Apophis.